"You must be Ethan Miller," the woman said, but the surprise in her voice carried none of the warmth he had expected from a blind date. Ethan stopped beside the candlelit table, one hand still resting on the back of the empty chair. Across from him sat Claire Whitmore, the chief executive officer of Whitmore Technologies, the same woman whose quiet footsteps could silence an entire conference room before she spoke a single word. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. "This has to be a mistake. I was told I was meeting Megan's friend. Megan is my sister." The words fell between them like broken glass. Around them, silverware touched porcelain, low jazz drifted through the restaurant, and strangers continued laughing beneath warm amber lights. But at their table, the air had gone cold. Claire slowly closed the menu. Her expression was controlled, yet Ethan recognized the look immediately. It was the same expression she wore when someone had wasted company time. "Did you know?" she asked. "No. Did Megan tell you who I was?" "She told me her sister was intelligent, private, and impossible to impress." For the first time, something almost human flickered behind Claire's eyes, but it disappeared just as quickly. She glanced at Ethan's plain navy jacket, the faint grease mark near one cuff, and the inexpensive watch he had worn for 8 years. Ethan noticed the judgment, but he did not defend himself. He had spent too much of his life learning that dignity did not need an argument. Claire leaned back. "This is inappropriate." "I agree. You work for me." "I do." "Then we should end this before it becomes embarrassing." Ethan's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from the quiet sting of being dismissed before he had even sat down. He had nearly canceled the evening twice. His daughter Sophie had helped choose his shirt, then stood in the kitchen doorway and told him that good people sometimes needed second chances too. Now Claire was looking at him as though he had crossed an invisible line simply by arriving. At the neighboring table, a sharply dressed man who had been listening too closely gave Ethan a brief, amused glance. Claire noticed it too. Her face hardened, and for one painful moment, Ethan understood that she was not only rejecting the date. She was protecting herself from being seen with someone beneath her rank. Still, he pulled out the chair and sat down. Claire stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Having dinner." "I just said this should end." "You did. Then why are you still here?" Ethan folded his hands on the table. "Because I promised my daughter I would not judge someone before giving them a fair chance." The answer silenced her. Claire looked toward the window, where rain traced slow lines across the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "You brought your daughter into this." "No, I brought her wisdom." The server approached, sensed the tension, and gently placed 2 glasses of water between them. Claire reached for hers, but did not drink. Ethan noticed a second place card partly hidden beneath her purse, one with another man's name printed across it. Before he could ask, the sharply dressed stranger from the next table stood, buttoned his suit, and walked directly toward them with the confidence of someone who already believed he belonged there. Claire's hand froze around the glass. Ethan saw the smallest change in her expression, not irritation this time, but fear carefully disguised as control. And suddenly, the blind date no longer felt like Megan's harmless mistake. Bradley Kane stopped beside their table with the polished confidence of a man who had never doubted that every room belonged to him. His tailored charcoal suit looked as though it had been made specifically to impress people before he ever spoke. He smiled at Claire first, barely acknowledging Ethan. "I did not expect to find you entertaining company tonight," Bradley said. Claire remained seated, her fingers still resting against the untouched glass of water. "This is not what it looks like." Bradley glanced toward Ethan with a faint smile that carried more judgment than kindness. "I certainly hope not." Ethan quietly stood, extending his hand with simple courtesy. "Ethan Miller." Bradley looked at the offered handshake for a brief moment before reluctantly accepting it. "Bradley Kane, Executive Vice President." The emphasis on his title was impossible to miss. Ethan simply nodded. "Nice to meet you." Bradley released his hand almost immediately and turned back toward Claire. "The investors are expecting us upstairs in 30 minutes. They will not appreciate delays." Claire answered calmly. "They can wait." Bradley's smile faded slightly. "Can they?" The question was aimed at Claire, but the message was clearly intended for Ethan. Silence settled over the table again. Ethan noticed something unusual. Claire was not annoyed by Bradley's interruption. She seemed exhausted by it. It was the expression of someone carrying a conversation that had lasted far longer than one evening. Bradley finally looked directly at Ethan. You work in facilities, correct? Operations maintenance, Ethan answered. Oh. Bradley nodded slowly. An important job. The pause that followed made the compliment sound almost like an insult. Someone has to keep the lights on. Ethan smiled politely. That is true. Bradley leaned slightly closer. You know, corporate leadership requires difficult decisions. Boundaries matter. Ethan understood exactly what he meant. Employees belonged in the factory. Executives belonged in private dining rooms. Claire watched the exchange without speaking. She expected Ethan to become defensive like so many others before him. Instead, he calmly picked up his menu. You are probably right, Ethan said. Boundaries are important. So is keeping promises. Bradley frowned. Promises. Ethan looked toward Claire. I promised your sister's invitation deserved enough respect for me to arrive on time. I also promised my daughter that if I accepted this dinner, I would treat the person across the table with kindness regardless of how the evening unfolded. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief second. Bradley laughed softly. Your daughter gives dating advice? Ethan answered without embarrassment. Children usually remind adults about things adults forget. Bradley had no immediate reply. The server returned, asking whether anyone wished to order dinner. Claire surprised both men by closing her menu. 3 meals, please. Bradley looked at her with genuine confusion. 3. Claire nodded. Since you have already interrupted the evening, you may as well join us. Bradley smiled, believing he had regained control. Ethan quietly suspected Claire had accepted for an entirely different reason. As the server walked away, conversation shifted toward ordinary topics. Bradley spoke confidently about mergers, market expansion, executive strategy, and luxury travel. Claire contributed politely, but without enthusiasm. Ethan mostly listened, occasionally asking thoughtful questions rather than offering opinions. After nearly 20 minutes, Bradley excused himself to answer an important telephone call. The moment he disappeared, Claire released a slow breath she seemed to have been holding all evening. Ethan pretended not to notice. Instead, he gently unfolded his napkin and looked toward the rain beyond the restaurant windows. You do not have to explain anything, he said quietly. Claire stared at him. Most people would already be asking questions. Ethan smiled faintly. Questions can wait. Sometimes people simply need someone willing to sit through an uncomfortable silence. Claire studied his face carefully. For the first time since the evening had begun, she no longer saw the maintenance technician everyone overlooked inside the company. She saw a father whose calmness had clearly been earned, not inherited. Before either of them could say another word, Ethan's phone vibrated softly across the table. The message appeared on the screen from Sophie. It contained only 6 simple words. Dad, I hope she smiles tonight. Claire accidentally caught the message before Ethan could turn the phone over, and something inside her carefully protected heart shifted in complete silence. Claire stared at the message on Ethan's phone for only a second before respectfully looking away. 6 simple words lingered in her mind far longer than she expected. Dad, I hope she smiles tonight. Nobody had ever entered a business dinner hoping she would smile. They usually hoped she would approve a proposal, sign a contract, or agree to an acquisition. Ethan quietly slipped the phone back into his pocket without embarrassment. She checks on me whenever I go somewhere unfamiliar, he explained. Claire raised an eyebrow. She was not worried about your blind date. Ethan smiled softly. She was worried about me. That answer settled gently between them. Bradley returned moments later carrying the same polished confidence he had left with. Dinner arrived, and conversation shifted again. Bradley described ambitious expansion plans, expensive conferences in Europe, and the importance of maintaining an executive image. Ethan listened politely while cutting into his grilled chicken. Claire barely touched her meal. Finally, Bradley looked directly at Ethan. What do you actually do after work? Ethan shrugged slightly. Homework. Bradley laughed. I meant professionally. That is professional enough for me. Claire noticed Ethan was completely serious. Bradley leaned back. Surely you have bigger ambitions. Ethan considered the question before answering. When Sophie was younger, my biggest ambition was making it home before bedtime every night. Bradley smiled politely, but his expression revealed he could not understand the answer. You sacrificed your career? Ethan shook his head. No, I chose my family. Claire slowly placed her fork on the table. Something about the quiet certainty in Ethan's voice made the restaurant around them seem strangely distant. She had spent years postponing birthdays, canceling vacations, and missing holidays because another meeting always seemed urgent. Across the table sat a man who measured success by entirely different standards. Bradley attempted to redirect the conversation. Children eventually grow up. Careers do not wait forever. Ethan nodded. Neither do childhood memories. Silence returned once again. This time it felt less uncomfortable and more thoughtful. Claire finally asked the question she had been carrying since the evening began. How old is your daughter? 9. Does she know where you work? Ethan smiled. She thinks I fix problems. Bradley chuckled. That is an oversimplification. Ethan looked toward him kindly. Children usually describe people better than adults do. Claire found herself smiling before she realized it. It was small, almost invisible, but Ethan noticed it immediately. He did not mention it. He simply smiled back, as though he had been waiting for nothing more than that single moment. The tension around the table softened. Claire surprised herself by asking another question. What does Sophie want to become? Ethan's face brightened in a way Claire had never witnessed inside the office. Every Tuesday, she wants a different career. Last week, she wanted to become a veterinarian. Yesterday, she decided astronauts probably get better stories. Claire laughed quietly, the sound catching even her by surprise. Several diners nearby glanced toward their table, not because the laughter was loud, but because it seemed so unexpected coming from the woman known throughout Whitmore Technologies as impossible to read. Bradley looked increasingly uncomfortable. The conversation was moving somewhere he could not control. He checked his watch again. Claire, we should really leave. Tomorrow's board meeting begins at 8. Claire calmly looked at him. I know what time my meeting starts. Bradley hesitated before standing. Then I will see you tomorrow. He offered Ethan a brief nod that carried little warmth before walking toward the exit. As the restaurant door closed behind him, the evening became remarkably quieter. Claire slowly exhaled. Thank you. Ethan looked puzzled. For what? She stared through the rain-covered window before answering. For treating me like a person instead of a position. Ethan gently folded his napkin and smiled with the same quiet dignity she had begun to admire. Claire, titles disappear the moment someone goes home. People do not. She lowered her eyes, knowing those simple words had reached a place inside her that years of success never had. Outside, the rain finally began to slow, but neither of them noticed Megan quietly standing across the street beneath an umbrella, watching the restaurant with a relieved smile, because the evening she had secretly hoped would end in disaster had instead become the beginning of something neither sister had expected. The following morning, Whitmore Technologies looked exactly as it always had. The glass entrance reflected the first rays of sunlight. Employees hurried through the revolving doors with coffee cups in hand, and the elevators carried managers toward executive offices while technicians disappeared into the operations levels below. Yet for Ethan Miller, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He had barely stepped onto the production floor when several coworkers greeted him with their usual smiles, completely unaware that only 12 hours earlier he had shared dinner with the company's chief executive officer. Ethan intended to keep it that way. He believed some conversations belonged outside the workplace. He quietly reviewed maintenance schedules, inspected equipment logs, and began his routine inspection across the assembly lines. Nearly an hour later, an announcement requested all department supervisors and senior staff to attend the weekly operations briefing. Ethan was not expected to attend, but a malfunction involving one of the production monitoring systems required a maintenance representative to remain nearby. He entered the conference room carrying only his inspection tablet and stood respectfully near the back wall. Moments later, the room became silent as Claire Whitmore walked inside. Her expression was once again composed, professional, and impossible to read. If anyone expected a trace of the woman who had smiled over dinner the night before, they found nothing. Claire briefly scanned the room before beginning the meeting. For only the smallest fraction of a second, her eyes met Ethan's. Neither smiled. Neither acknowledged the previous evening. They were simply Chief Executive Officer and Maintenance Technician once again. Bradley Kane sat confidently beside Claire, leading much of the discussion about an upcoming partnership that could become the largest contract in company history. Charts appeared across large presentation screens while executives discussed deadlines, efficiency targets, and production capacity. Ethan remained silent until one engineering manager mentioned an equipment calibration schedule that immediately caught his attention. Something about the proposed timeline did not match the maintenance records he had reviewed earlier that morning. Ethan hesitated. He was only there because of the monitoring system. Speaking during executive meetings was not part of his job. Bradley noticed him looking toward the presentation. "Is there a problem?" he asked with a hint of amusement. Several executives turned toward Ethan. He answered carefully. "The calibration schedule may overlap with preventive maintenance on line 7. Bradley smiled politely. "Operations has already approved the schedule." Ethan nodded. "I understand." Bradley continued. "Then there is no issue." Ethan quietly lowered his eyes. He could have argued. Instead, he simply made a note on his tablet. Claire watched the exchange without interrupting. 20 minutes later, the meeting ended. As executives gathered their documents, Claire spoke without raising her voice. "Mr. Miller, would you remain for a moment?" The room gradually emptied until only Claire and Ethan remained inside the conference room. Bradley paused at the doorway. "Claire, our next meeting begins in 10 minutes. She answered without looking away from Ethan. "I will be there shortly." Bradley hesitated before leaving. The door quietly closed behind him. Claire folded her hands on the conference table. "Why did you stop talking?" Ethan looked slightly surprised. "Because the decision had already been made. You believed the schedule was wrong." "Yes." "Then why not continue?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Correcting someone is easy. Embarrassing someone in front of their team is harder to repair." Claire studied him in thoughtful silence. Few people inside the company understood the difference. Most cared only about proving themselves right. Ethan cared about preserving respect even when he disagreed. Claire slowly opened the maintenance report displayed on his tablet. Within seconds, she discovered exactly what Ethan had noticed. The proposed calibration would indeed interrupt critical preventive maintenance, increasing the risk of unexpected downtime during the partnership launch. She looked back at him with genuine surprise. "You saw this immediately?" Ethan nodded. It stood out. Claire closed the tablet and quietly smiled, though only for a heartbeat. "Mr. Miller." Ethan looked up. "Would you have told me if I had made the mistake?" He answered without hesitation. "Privately." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment, realizing that while many people around her competed for influence, the quiet man standing before her was protecting something far more valuable than his reputation. He was protecting hers. For the rest of the morning, Ethan returned to the production floor as though nothing unusual had happened. He completed inspection reports, answered questions from newer technicians, and patiently helped one employee troubleshoot a conveyor sensor that had been giving inconsistent readings since the previous week. Nobody watching him would have guessed he had just corrected a multi-million-dollar scheduling mistake without asking for recognition. That quiet consistency stayed with Claire long after she left the conference room. She entered her executive office overlooking the entire manufacturing campus, but instead of opening financial reports, she found herself thinking about a single sentence. Correcting someone is easy. Embarrassing someone in front of their team is harder to repair. She had spent years believing strong leadership meant never appearing uncertain. Ethan had somehow demonstrated greater confidence by choosing humility instead. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Megan stepped inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled the moment she noticed Claire staring silently through the windows. "You are thinking about him," Megan said. Claire did not deny it. "I am trying to understand him." Megan laughed quietly. "Good luck. Most people spend months trying." Claire accepted the coffee. "How long have you known Ethan?" "Almost 5 years." "And you never mentioned him?" Megan shrugged. "You never asked about anyone outside the executive offices." Claire looked down at the warm cup in her hands. Megan continued more gently. "Do you know why everyone on the operations floor respects him?" Claire assumed the answer involved technical skill. Megan slowly shook her head before Claire could respond. "Because every time someone makes a mistake, Ethan helps solve it before asking who caused it." Those words lingered inside the office after Megan left. Later that afternoon, Claire quietly contacted Human Resources and requested Ethan's employment file. She expected an ordinary maintenance history with steady performance reviews. Instead, she found something completely different. Every annual evaluation described exceptional problem-solving, remarkable leadership under pressure, and consistent mentorship of younger employees. Several supervisors had recommended promotions over the years. Every recommendation had been declined by Ethan himself. Claire frowned with genuine confusion. She opened another document. Promotion declined due to family scheduling. She opened another. Leadership opportunity respectfully declined. Requested stable shift to care for daughter. Another. Transfer refused. Priority remains daughter's school schedule. Claire leaned back in complete silence. Success had repeatedly knocked on Ethan's door, and he had answered by asking whether it would allow him to be home in time for dinner with Sophie. There were no complaints inside the file. No requests for special treatment. No bitterness. Only quiet decisions made over many years. Before she could continue reading, Bradley entered without waiting for permission. I heard you requested a maintenance employee's records. Claire calmly closed the file. Yes. Bradley crossed the room with measured confidence. You are becoming unusually interested in Mr. Miller. I am interested in understanding my employees. Bradley smiled politely. With respect, Chief Executive Officer, maintenance technicians are not responsible for strategic decisions. Claire met his eyes. No, but they often protect the people who are. Bradley's expression tightened for only a moment. You are giving him too much credit. Claire answered evenly. Perhaps I have been giving him too little. Bradley said nothing further, but the conversation unsettled him more than he cared to admit. After he left, Claire reopened Ethan's file and discovered one final attachment she had nearly overlooked. It was a handwritten thank you note from the parents of a young apprentice who had almost resigned after making an expensive mistake. The letter ended with one simple sentence. Your employee reminded our son that character is measured by how people are treated on their worst day. Claire slowly folded the letter and looked out across the factory floor where hundreds of people were finishing another ordinary shift. Somewhere below, Ethan was likely cleaning his tools, preparing to pick up Sophie from school, completely unaware that the quiet life he had built through sacrifice was beginning to change the heart of the one person who had spent years believing respect could only be earned through authority. The next week began with unusual pressure hanging over Whitmore Technologies. The company was only days away from demonstrating its new production system to a group of investors whose decision could shape the future of the business for years to come. Every department worked longer hours. Every meeting ended with another checklist, and every delay felt larger than it really was. Ethan noticed the change the moment he arrived before sunrise. The maintenance requests had nearly doubled overnight. He quietly organized the work orders, assigned easier tasks to newer technicians, and kept the more complicated diagnostics for himself. He believed that confidence grew when people were trusted with work they could complete successfully. Around mid-morning, an urgent message appeared across the internal communication system. A critical environmental control unit supporting Line 7 had begun reporting unstable temperature readings. Although production had not stopped, the inconsistency threatened the certification process required for the upcoming investor demonstration. Managers hurried across the factory floor while engineers gathered around computer screens searching for an explanation. Bradley Kane quickly assumed command, directing teams from one station to another with growing urgency. Ethan arrived carrying only his diagnostic tablet and a small equipment case. He quietly observed the monitoring screens without interrupting anyone. Replace the control module, Bradley ordered. It is obviously failing. One engineer hesitated. The diagnostic codes do not fully support that conclusion. Bradley answered firmly. We do not have time for theories. Ethan remained silent. He studied the live sensor history instead of the warning lights. Something about the data felt familiar. The readings were fluctuating at perfectly regular intervals, almost as though another system was feeding incorrect information rather than the controller failing itself. Claire entered the operations center moments later. She immediately noticed the tension. Status. Bradley responded confidently. We are replacing the controller. Claire glanced toward Ethan, who was still reviewing the data without saying a word. She remembered the conference room only days before. Mr. Miller, she said calmly, what do you see? Every conversation stopped. Ethan looked up slowly. I am not certain yet. Bradley folded his arms. The controller has already been identified. Ethan nodded respectfully. Perhaps. Claire waited. And if it has not? Ethan gently enlarged a series of graphs on the monitor. The temperature spikes occur every exactly 15 minutes. Mechanical failures rarely become that punctual. Something is reporting incorrect values. Bradley shook his head. We cannot delay because of possibilities. Ethan did not argue. Instead, He quietly connected his tablet to the monitoring network and reviewed the secondary calibration logs. Less than a minute later, he found what he had suspected. During a recent software update, one backup environmental sensor had never completed synchronization with the primary monitoring system. The controller was responding perfectly. The false readings came from a single unsynchronized sensor transmitting outdated calibration values. Ethan calmly disconnected the affected sensor from the network. Within seconds, every warning disappeared. Stable green indicators returned across the entire display wall. The production line continued operating without interruption. Complete silence filled the operations center. Nobody spoke because everyone understood what had almost happened. Replacing the controller would have required hours of downtime while solving nothing. Bradley slowly lowered the replacement module, still resting in his hands. Claire looked from the screens to Ethan with quiet admiration. "How long would it have taken to replace the controller?" she asked one engineer. "At least 6 hours," he admitted. Claire turned back toward Ethan. "And your solution?" Ethan closed his tablet with the same calm expression he always carried. "About 3 minutes." He picked up his equipment case, preparing to return to his ordinary maintenance schedule as though nothing remarkable had happened. But as he walked toward the door, Claire realized the room was not watching the production screens anymore. Every eye had quietly followed the man who had once again protected the company without asking anyone to notice. News of the incident traveled through Whitmore Technologies far faster than any official announcement. Engineers quietly discussed the mysterious temperature failure that had disappeared in only a few minutes. Supervisors compared maintenance logs. Technicians simply smiled because they already knew who had solved it. Ethan never joined those conversations. He spent the remainder of the afternoon replacing worn bearings on an older conveyor system while patiently explaining preventive maintenance to a newly hired apprentice. When the younger technician apologized for asking too many questions, Ethan smiled warmly. "The only expensive question is the one nobody asks." The apprentice nodded, remembering every word. Across the campus, Claire sat alone in her office reviewing the incident report. She expected to find Ethan's name listed as the lead investigator. Instead, the report credited the operations response team as a whole. Ethan had submitted his technical notes without placing his own name anywhere in the summary. Claire looked at the document twice before calling the operations manager. "Who prepared this report?" she asked. "Mr. Miller provided the technical findings," the manager answered. "Then why is he not listed?" There was a brief pause. "He asked us to recognize the entire team." He said everyone responded quickly once the real problem became clear. Claire slowly thanked the manager before ending the call. She remained silent for several minutes. Every executive she had worked with fought for visibility. Ethan quietly stepped away from it. Later that afternoon, she walked onto the production floor without announcing her visit. Employees greeted her respectfully before returning to work. She found Ethan kneeling beside an open equipment panel while the young apprentice held a flashlight. Ethan pointed toward a small alignment mark inside the machine. "Always look for the simplest explanation before assuming the biggest failure," he said. "Machines are surprisingly honest. People just stop listening." Claire stood a few feet away without interrupting. When the repair was finished, the apprentice thanked Ethan and returned to his assignment. Ethan finally noticed Claire waiting nearby. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller." They walked together through the quiet service corridor overlooking the production lines. Neither spoke immediately. The steady sound of machines filled the silence between them. Claire finally stopped near a large observation window. "Why did you remove your name from the report?" Ethan looked slightly puzzled. "Because the company succeeded. You solved the problem." "The company solved the problem." Claire folded her arms gently. "Recognition matters." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes. Not to you." He smiled thoughtfully. "Recognition is meaningful when it encourages people. It becomes dangerous when people begin working only to receive it." Claire lowered her eyes. She remembered meetings where credit had been negotiated more fiercely than solutions. Ethan had quietly lived by a different standard all along. Before she could respond, Bradley approached from the opposite end of the corridor. His expression remained polite, but his eyes revealed growing frustration. "Claire, the investors have arrived earlier than expected." She nodded. "I will meet them shortly." Bradley glanced toward Ethan. "Maintenance can handle maintenance. Executive leadership has more pressing responsibilities." Ethan simply stepped aside to allow them to pass. Claire, however, remained exactly where she was. "Mr. Miller," she said clearly enough for Bradley to hear. "Thank you for protecting this company today." Ethan answered with the same humility he had shown since the night they first met. "I was only doing my job." Claire gently shook her head. "No, you were protecting people who did not even realize they needed protecting." Bradley said nothing, but the public acknowledgement unsettled him more than any technical mistake ever could. As Claire walked away toward the executive conference center, she realized the admiration growing inside her had very little to do with Ethan's remarkable ability to solve problems. It came from something far rarer. Every time he had an opportunity to elevate himself, he quietly chose instead to elevate everyone around him. The investor presentation began exactly at 9 o'clock the following morning. Executives gathered inside the largest conference room at Whitmore Technologies, while engineers monitored live production data from the control center below. Everything had to operate perfectly. Claire welcomed the visitors with calm confidence, introducing the company's vision, its technology, and the dedicated people behind every achievement. Bradley led the financial projections with his usual polished delivery, speaking about efficiency, leadership, and future expansion. From the production floor, Ethan barely knew the meeting had started. He was inspecting a packaging line alongside two junior technicians when his radio crackled with urgency. "Operations to maintenance. Immediate assistance requested in the central control room." Ethan responded without panic. "On my way." By the time he reached the control center, several engineers had already surrounded the monitoring screens. A series of communication alarms had appeared between the production scheduling server and the automated packaging network. The machinery itself continued operating, but the reporting system feeding the investor demonstration screens upstairs had frozen. If the data remained unavailable, the visitors would believe the company's flagship automation platform had failed during the most important presentation of the year. Bradley's voice echoed through the conference room speakerphone. "Restore the reporting system immediately." Engineers worked quickly, restarting software services and checking network connections, but the frozen display refused to update. Ethan quietly stepped behind the group without interrupting anyone. He watched the activity for nearly a minute before asking one simple question. "Did anyone verify the synchronization gateway?" One engineer answered while continuing to type. "The servers are online." Ethan nodded. "That was not my question." The room became quiet. He walked toward a secondary monitoring terminal and reviewed the communication pathway instead of the application itself. Within moments, he discovered a scheduled security update had automatically redirected one authentication certificate overnight. The production equipment was functioning exactly as designed. Only the reporting gateway had lost authorization to display live information. Ethan calmly restored the certificate and restarted a single communication service. Less than 1 minute later, every dashboard upstairs refreshed simultaneously. Production numbers, quality metrics, and efficiency charts appeared in real time across the large presentation screens. The investors smiled with visible relief. Inside the conference room, Bradley immediately resumed speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. "As you can see, our systems remain exceptionally reliable." Claire looked toward the refreshed displays, but did not continue listening. She quietly asked the technology director through her headset, "Who restored the system?" The answer came almost instantly. "Mr. Miller." Claire thanked him before turning back toward the audience. She looked across the room at executives proudly accepting compliments for a crisis they had not solved. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone, including Bradley. She stepped away from the podium. "Before we continue," she said warmly, "I need to correct something important. A few moments ago, our reporting system experienced an unexpected communication issue. The person responsible for resolving it was not standing in this room. He is downstairs ensuring our employees can keep doing their work safely and efficiently." Bradley's smile slowly disappeared. Claire continued, "Leadership is not measured by who speaks during success. Leadership is measured by who quietly protects others when problems appear." She asked the operations manager to invite Ethan upstairs. Several minutes later, Ethan entered the conference room, still wearing his maintenance uniform and carrying the same small equipment case he had used all week. The room became unexpectedly silent. Claire looked directly at him with genuine respect. "Mr. Miller, Thank you for reminding all of us that excellence does not always wear an executive title. Ethan seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. He smiled gently before answering in the same quiet voice everyone had come to recognize. I only wanted the team to keep moving forward. His words filled the room with a silence far more powerful than applause because, for the first time, every investor, every executive, and every employee understood exactly who had been protecting the company's future all along. 6 months passed, and Whitmore Technologies looked different in ways no financial report could fully measure. The investor partnership had become the most successful agreement in the company's history, but Claire often reminded her leadership team that the greatest transformation had never appeared on a balance sheet. It had begun the day people started seeing one another before noticing job titles. A new mentoring program paired experienced employees with younger team members regardless of department or position. Executives spent one morning each month working alongside technicians, warehouse staff, and customer service representatives. Recognition meetings no longer celebrated only results. They celebrated character, patience, and quiet leadership. Ethan accepted every change with the same calm humility that had defined him from the beginning. He politely declined another management promotion, explaining that his current schedule still allowed him to pick Sophie up from school every afternoon. This time, however, Claire did not question his decision. She respected it. Instead, she adjusted company policies so more parents could choose flexible schedules without sacrificing future opportunities. One Friday evening, the annual community school fair filled the local elementary campus with music, colorful lights, and the laughter of families enjoying the beginning of summer. Ethan stood beside Sophie at a small science booth where she proudly demonstrated the simple robotics project they had built together on weekends. Claire quietly entered through the front gate wearing jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a light blue sweater. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, nobody recognized her immediately. She was simply another visitor carrying a homemade pie that Megan had insisted she bring. Sophie spotted her first. Her face brightened with unmistakable excitement. "Dad?" she whispered with a grin. She smiled before she even saw us. Ethan looked toward the entrance and could not help smiling himself. Claire walked over, slightly nervous in a way board meetings had never made her feel. Sophie welcomed her with complete sincerity, eagerly explaining every detail of the robotics display while Claire listened with genuine interest. Ethan watched quietly, realizing that Claire was no longer trying to impress anyone. She was simply present. As the evening continued, parents gathered on the football field while children released dozens of paper lanterns into the darkening sky. The warm lights floated upward together, each one carrying handwritten hopes for the future. Claire looked around at the families, sharing simple moments that money could never purchase. She finally understood why Ethan had never regretted the opportunities he had declined. Some successes could only be measured at home. They stood together beneath the glowing lanterns without speaking for a while. The silence felt comfortable now. It no longer carried uncertainty. It carried peace. Ethan finally turned toward Claire with the same gentle confidence that had first surprised her at the restaurant months earlier. "Would you like to have dinner with me next Friday?" he asked. Claire smiled, the kind of smile Sophie had unknowingly wished for on that rainy evening. "Is this another blind date?" Ethan laughed softly. "No. This time we both know exactly who is sitting across the table." Claire nodded. "Then I would love to come." Sophie quietly slipped her small hand into Ethan's and reached for Claire's with the other. Together they watched the last lantern disappear into the summer night. In that quiet moment, nobody saw a maintenance technician or a chief executive officer. They saw a father who had never traded his dignity for recognition, a woman who had learned that respect begins with listening, and a little girl whose simple hope had opened the door to a second chance. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not that life suddenly becomes easier. It is that kindness patiently changes hearts until one ordinary evening becomes the beginning of an extraordinary future.